Welcome to China Tech Talk, a weekly discussion of technology and startups here in China. I am John Artman, editor-in-chief of TechNode, and as always, I'm joined by Matthew Brennan, founder of China Channel. So for this episode, we wanted to kind of do a bit of like a fundamentals of the ecosystem, or the environment that Chinese technology is operating in. Matt and I were discussing, kind of some of the ideas that have kind of been banging around in our heads, and looking back on some of our previous episodes, we realized that we haven't really devoted an episode to kind of talking about, the water that we're all kind of swimming in here in China. And I think that it's one of those areas that for Matt and I, it's an everyday part of our life. And so in some senses, it's easy to forget how different China can be. And also the fact that people outside of China don't necessarily understand it all that well. So we wanted to take the time for this episode to talk about what's happening here, and what are some of the main drivers of the unique environment that is China.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover. So reference episode, definitely going over the basics of what makes China different, right? Why is the broader environment that we're working in? I think that metaphor is great that you used, John. The water that we're swimming in. That's the perfect metaphor here.
But I think Matt, why don't we just cover kind of some of the obvious points first? Obvious, but more foundational. And of course, I think the biggest one, of course, is economic growth. The speed and the scale of economic growth here in China. I mean, we're looking at what is now the second largest economy by GDP in the entire world. And for many, many years, the growth of GDP has been in double digits, 10 to 11%. Over the last 3 to 5 years, that has slowed down to about 6.57%. But still, even then, when you're looking at economies in the EU, after the financial crisis, maybe less than 1%. The United States is lucky to get 2% GDP growth, and China is still posting 6.5 to 7, which is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great place to start. So change is expected in China. People are used to it. Once you've been through 20, 30 years of that type of growth, where 6-7% is slow, what does that mean for your daily life? Well, it means that here in China are actually quite optimistic. I think that there is some data or statistic, I can't remember, compared to other places in the world, broadly more optimistic about their lives improving year on year, because the reality is that people's lives do improve year on year. And when I say improve, I'm talking about in terms of wealth, in terms of job opportunities, in terms of the facilities and the environment around them. So the most visible way that when people visit, heck of a lot of construction that goes on in China, they're always tearing things down and building new stuff, usually bigger, taller, more expensive stuff in the place of the old things. So Chinese people are used to change, and this actually has a huge impact on how they approach digital products, because often with technology, the challenge is not the technology itself. It's the user habits. It's gaining usage adoption. It's getting people to try the way of doing things, to try new product. And Chinese love trying new things, and they're positive and more optimistic about change in general. A huge advantage for Chinese companies and Chinese tech companies in particular.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the point here is positive change. I mean, you look at the 20th century for China was amazingly chaotic. There was a lot of misery, a lot of tragedy, and a lot of good things happening as well, and especially in the last 30 years or so. But China in the last century has been has been the story of upheaval, and I think just with the reform and opening, things have kind of settled down quite a bit. Under a very strong leader like Xi Jinping, it definitely feels like things are smoothing out a little bit. But I think whenever you're talking about what's happening now in China and the affinity for change and for technological progress, I think you have to remember that in many ways, people are still haunted by many of the things that happened in China's modern history, and of course, if we want to get into the political aspect, of course, you can call it the century of humiliation, but there's a lot more to it. I mean, under Mao Zedong, there was a lot of upheaval. There was a lot of unpredictable change in the fabric of society, where religions were cast out, Confucianism was cast out, active, like this type of thinking was actively purged from the Chinese culture as the Communist Party began to install its own ideology in the country, and in some ways now we're kind of seeing a resurgence of religion and Confucianism. Funny enough, but I think that also kind of speaks to why Chinese people are so willing to adopt and try out new technology. In some ways, again, they're looking for a better life. They as the economy is growing, life in general is getting much easier, and people are continually looking for new ways in order to take advantage of that. And then also, when you look at the absence of belief, in a sense, people now seem to be more believing in technology in a way, if that makes sense. Where technology in some ways is kind of filling the gaps that traditional belief systems have fit in for many cultures and peoples around the world. Whereas in China, there is this belief that technology itself does make your life better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's no exaggeration to say that technology is the new religion in China. To get rich is glorious is the phrase that Deng Xiaoping used before, and I think that characterized a lot of the 80s and 90s in China, where the pursuit of money and material wealth was almost the religion. But now I think that's transitioning into a position where people are seeing technology and the advancement of technology as the ultimate goal of society, and that's very much being supported by the government. And to go back to your point about change and the massive gut-wrenching change that society has been through since the 60s all the way through to now, something that really struck me was how in China, you don't really find these terms millennials or Generation Z or Generation whatever to describe the different groups of people. How Chinese describe the different generations is they use these phrases Ling Ling Ho, Zhou Ling Ho, Zhou Wu Ho. This basically means you're born after the year 2000, or you're born after the year 1990, or and what this displays is that they actually measure these in 5-year gaps. So the people who are, in terms of the characteristics of people using internet products who are born after the year of 1990 will be different, substantially different from those born after the year 1995. That 5-year, there is a noticeable difference in user habits and in terms of their beliefs and their consumption habits. So that just gives you an example that in a 5-year period, there can be a generation gap in China. That's really quite amazing when you think about it. But it's true. It's true. There are. So the young people in China are it's when you compare younger and older generations in China, it's like they're living in sort of, you've brought together people from almost different historical periods, and they're living together in one place and in one family, often perhaps in one apartment. So that gut-wrenching change is here in China is really pretty hard unless you see it and experience it firsthand to realize how different that is from other areas of the world when you've gone through so much change in such a short period of time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I was just thinking about, if you have that many people in a family, let's say 2 or 3 generations, in one family with very different experiences of the world and how their life is, and how they use technology in their daily life, and then thinking about super apps, thinking about applications or platforms like Taobao, applications like WeChat and things like that, where these companies and these platforms, they're able to create experiences for people of different generations. I think DD is actually a really great example of this as well, where for a while now, DD, they have a feature specifically for older people, people who are not used to using smartphones, maybe people whose eyesight isn't very good, and you can very, very quickly and easily see. You can type in where you want to go and where you are, and that's it. Whereas the interface, the quote unquote normal interface for people like you and I, we open it up and it's a bit busy. There's a lot of choices. There's a lot of different options we can choose. But then for older people, all you have to do is just put where you are, put where you want to go, and then tap a button, and that's it. And so I was just thinking, like how these super apps, so these applications that are able to kind of cross boundaries, both in terms of vertical, but then also in terms of generations, how in some ways like these are kind of creating a touch point for people of different generations. And WeChat, again, is a great example, where, my parents-in-law, they're in their 60s now. They've not used to using smartphones. They only put internet in their house maybe 2 years ago. They use WeChat all the time. And so for us and our family, and my wife and her parents, and then my kids and their grandparents, WeChat is that touch point, and so they use it for a bunch of different stuff, and we use it for a bunch of different stuff. But at the end of the day, we all use it to communicate with each other.
Yeah, the usage habits are different. I think WeChat released a video and some data about that. I think it was around January time, actually. I wrote about it. Older users prefer to use video. They prefer to use voice. They're not so into typing characters. The sad fact is a lot of, especially inland areas, are illiterate, or they're not so good at typing. The factors that play into it. But we have so. It's a huge market, right? It's a massive market. It's the biggest. There's over 700 million mobile users in China, population 1.3 billion. It's only India can compare, but India's not as homogenous. This market is incredibly homogenous. Again, that's one of the legacies of the government here, is that they've, for decades now, strictly enforced standardized policies across the country. I'm not saying China's not diverse; it's incredibly diverse. But in terms of, there is a standardized system for, Putonghua, standard Chinese, which all people who've received, primary, secondary education will be able to speak. So there's a unified language, a unified pronunciation. Things like that have a massive impact in terms of homogenizing the market. You can go from way up north, to Harbin province on the border of Russia, and then down to Hainan province in a sort of tropical area near Vietnam, and you'll get the same hotel chains, you'll get the same convenience store chains. It's like America in that respect, right? You can go across the country and There's these massive. You can be wherever you go. You've got the same brands, the same chain stores there, because it's essentially a homogenous market. And in terms of the internet space, that opens up opportunities which just aren't available in other markets. Someone described it to me saying, in China there is no niche. Any niche, no matter how small, is still big, because the population here is so large.
Yeah.
So that makes what's possible in the internet space quite different here.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of Chinese companies are just not interested in focusing abroad. Still, that is changing.
That is changing.
Because that is changing for sure. But still, there's a lot of smaller, untapped possibilities in China, and there's a lot of people just are not interested in the global market because there's plenty of opportunities still here in China.
Exactly.
And
yeah, but that was interesting. So, talking about, the homogenized market of the U.S. versus the homogenized market in China, one of the reasons that that the U.S. market is a bit more homogenous is because of market forces, in a sense. In the 80s and 90s, there was quite a bit of mobility. People were moving around quite a bit in the United States, seeking jobs, seeking opportunities. And so they moved around. I mean, I'm a poster child of that era. We lived, I think, in like six different cities. I think, I was originally born in Texas, but I moved away from Texas when I was 4. And, at this point I have a fairly standard American accent, if you want to call it that. And I think, you have something similar, but for different reasons in China, where you, as you were saying, Matt, there is this huge homogenous market. Everyone basically speaks the same language, although some pronunciation might be a bit different. And there still are existing dialects. I mean, you go to Shanghai and they're very proud. You might find it difficult sometimes to speak Mandarin with them, but the point is that the homogenization that occurred in China was quite different. Whereas the U.S. was market-driven in a sense, China's homogenization is driven by the government. And I think that this is kind of a theme that we're probably going to touch upon again in this episode, where you look at the number of people speaking Mandarin or Putonghua, which means the common language, in China. The reason that so many people do speak Mandarin in China is because the government has mandated Mandarin education in schools. Some autonomous areas where there are fairly large ethnic minorities, they do have schools in that local language, but for the most part, they are going to be speaking Mandarin. And this kind of goes back to, I think one of the main goals of the Chinese government right now is to make sure that China stays one country. You look at, the mythology of the country, and China, as they tell it, as the myth goes, started with Qin Shi Huang, and that's actually where the Western name China comes from, is from Qin Shi Huang. And the myth is that he was the one that brought China together, and every single dynasty after the Qin dynasty, their main overriding goal was to unify China, to bring China all together. And I think that you definitely see a very similar motivation with this Chinese government, and they're very smart about it in a way. So number one, the government itself is very centralized, and number two, everyone speaks the same language. And so once you get everyone speaking the same language, unity is much easier. If you have a national curriculum, a nationalistic curriculum that is basically the same no matter where you go, preaching the Chinese people, preaching the unity of the country, then keeping the country together is much easier than otherwise.
Yeah, well, in terms of the internet space, the aspects here that really helped them advance quickly are things like having a unified ID card system. So in China, you have a Shenpenzhang, everyone has an ID card once they reach a certain age. That ID card number is a unique identifier. So this helps, this standardized system across the entire country makes registration processes, building those systems easier. Things like Union Pay. So there's a standardized Union Pay is the equivalent of MasterCard or Visa here in China, and they have a monopoly. There's only one system, and so if you're able to integrate your for WeChat Pay and Alipay originally, they piggyback off that system, but they only need really one integration. They just need to work with Union Pay. So that makes that whole thing easier and faster to build and simpler for people to understand. So there are all these benefits that come from what the government's been doing in terms of standardizing things, and this is not anything recent. This has been going on for decades. So another thing is in terms of from a historical perspective, we can see that the economy before was rather undeveloped in terms of the offerings that it had for consumer-facing products and services. So if we take retail as an example, what Alipay and JD have been able to do in partly has been facilitated by the fact that offline retail, bricks and mortar stores in China is okay, it's changing now, but it's we look back 10 years, it was really underdeveloped, especially when you compare it with something like the States, as an example. So offline retail is really not meeting the needs of consumers, and so that's where online really was able to pick up. They had some really low-hanging fruit in terms of some easy wins in because there was people couldn't buy what they want essentially. And also the government here, in terms of their economic management, one of the things that they've done is because they make so much of their money from sales of land, it kind of skews the economy so that rents and property is expensive. So this is a distortion of the economy, which we don't really see in too many other places around the world. But buying property and property prices compared to incomes and compared to the value of goods and services in the economy are distorted, and so they're relatively high. So that means for retail businesses, one of the big costs would be rent, or actually purchasing the facility, the storefront, and that cost is particularly high in China as a ratio compared to the other inputs. So that's something that gives pure online a big advantage because they will not have that cost.
But that movement also speaks to, again, kind of what's happening with government policy. As you have to remember that under in the 60s and 70s up until reform and opening, it was a centralized command economy where everything was centrally planned, everything was centrally allocated for better or for worse. And so what we've seen over the last 30 years is a slow but steady movement towards centrally controlled but not a command economy. So it's like a centrally controlled market economy, if that makes any sense. One of the main goals of the Chinese government, of the current Chinese government, is to make sure that everything stays fairly stable, and so to have stable growth, to avoid volatility in financial markets, to avoid volatility with commodities and basic things like that. And so when you're moving from brick and mortar to online, one of the things that means is that on the one hand, as you were saying, Matt, there's an incentive as a business person to open up an online store because the costs were much lower, but then also as a consumer, purchasing things online is much more desirable, in part because you can get what you want, or that's used to be one of the main motivations, was because you can go on Taobao and get pretty much anything that you could possibly want. These days also, it's becoming more convenient as well. One of the reasons that Jingdong has been successful is because they have their own logistics network that in many cases, can actually deliver your order on the exact same day. So off the online space, it's also been a question of convenience, where offline, shopping malls, other retail areas were just inconvenient to get to. Maybe they could take like an hour or 2 hours by public transportation. But now you can go on Taobao, you can go on Jingdong and get it delivered very, very easily. But that's what's really kind of interesting about how the internet environment, the technology environment in China is a bit different, where in many ways the government is becoming more and more comfortable with being laissez-faire with some innovations, as long as the innovation isn't too disruptive or it's not too threatening to some of their strategic priorities. They'll let these companies in these markets develop until they say, okay, wait a second, this is going a bit too far. We're gonna step in. Bike sharing is a great example, where it wasn't until recently that the tier 1 cities, so Beijing, Shenzhen, and Shanghai, really started to become a bit more strict about bike sharing. So these 3 cities, that they've mandated limits on the number of bikes that can actually be on the road. And this is almost 2 years since bike sharing started. And so it hasn't been until now, until it actually is beginning to cause real visible issues, that governments are beginning to step in. Mobile payments is another example, where I remember years ago, the People's Bank of China said that QR codes, that it is not, the QR codes are not allowed to be used to make mobile payments due to security risks. But, you look at it, and mobile payments was built on QR codes. And it wasn't until recently that QR codes were actually made legitimate.
Yeah, that was quite funny, actually. I remember that. Didn't they outlaw QR code payments by the regulation?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. Yeah, just goes to show how, you often see headlines around the world. They will make some new regulation. Oh my God, China's banned this. Oh, they've forbidden that. And it's not always the case. Yeah, so I think QR codes is kind of a poster child for that way of looking at things. I
think the thing is there's a caveat to that laissez-faire attitude, is that if they're more and more willing to be laissez-faire with some things, because they are actually very, very capable of swiftly shutting things down. A good example is the recent shutdown of ICO platforms and the halt of all China operations for cryptocurrency exchanges. They were, in the matter of like a week, all ICO platforms were shut down. All Bitcoin exchanges had been forced to stop. And this is when there really hasn't been much regulation. There have been some central statements, but there hasn't been much actual movement against ICOs or Bitcoin. And then once they decided to flip that switch, bam, they're all gone.
But I actually agree with that. They did need to shut it down. It was getting crazy. And it was not good for the economy, quite clearly. I don't know, man. Maybe that's a controversial viewpoint for some people, but I would say if we want to understand, is the government serious about banning something, then you just need to look at, is it good for China? Is it good for a stable, prosperous China? If it is, then it's going to be fine. But if it is, ICOs, what was going on was clearly getting out of hand. So it kind of made sense. And another thing I think that's quite important about the Chinese environment is that, because really, if we look back to the 80s and 70s, most Chinese people, let's be honest, most Chinese people were poor. China has lifted an incredible number of people out of poverty in the last 20 to 30 years. There's the UN that has targets for leaving poverty globally, and I think actually what's happened in China has far outstripped anything the UN's ever done to change that. Just by simply unleashing the entrepreneurial spirit and the market forces in the economy from how it was before. And entrepreneurial spirit is really, I think, the correct term to describe how Chinese people, small and medium-sized businesses work in China. People here are incredibly hardworking. It's not uncommon. In fact, the standard, I would say, for startups in China is to work what they call a 996 schedule. People here are working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. Now, obviously, some people would say there's questions to be asked about your mental and physical health, and is that a work-life balance? Is that the correct way to go? I don't want to go into that right now, but it's the fact is that's the way people work here. They work fast. You've just touched upon it earlier, John. Chinese consumers expect things to be fast. Now, whether that's in terms of deliveries of what they've bought online, or whether it's in terms of rather than using email, they'll use WeChat and expect a response within minutes, not days. There's many ways that this translates across things. And Chinese people are incredibly sensitive to financial incentives. So whereas in the States, if you wanted to gain traction with your app by offering a coupon, essentially bribing users to use your service, subsidizing it, you might have to offer a quite significant subsidy or a freebie for people to actually care about it. Whereas in China, you can offer very small coupons and subsidies, and people will still be interested in that. Any kind of discount, any kind of freebie that you can offer, people are more responsive to that here. They're more results focused, and they love to save, get a discount or save a penny here and there. So in terms of the consumer mindset, that's quite different, I think. It's different in a way that's really great for internet businesses.
So you have that 996 mentality, where you devote so much time to your work, but then also you end up a lot of times what happens is you end up creating a community inside of your work, and it's actually one of those things where it's as a foreigner who's very used to work versus personal life, work-life balance in terms of, not even just how often you work or how much you work, but also in terms of your relationships. It took a long time for me to get used to work relationships because in Chinese companies, because they end up seeming almost like personal relationships as well. And I think that part of it is Chinese culture in general, which prizes intimacy and a sense of closeness among peers. But then also, if you're spending so much time at work, you should be creating a community around it. But then also, of course, looking back at Chinese history with the Danwei system, where when it was a command economy, everything was organized. You worked with who you lived with. But then, Matt, getting back to the speed, I think that's one of those things where you don't really understand it unless you see it yourself. I think that for someone, it can be actually very bewildering. I've previously worked as a vendor to Chinese companies, and being a vendor to a Chinese company is very, very difficult because they do expect that speed, and when they ask for something, they want it now. Or they want it, very, very soon. And I think that it's actually kind of interesting because it's not just about they're able to rely on speed a little bit too much. And so what happens is things happen very, very quickly, but that also means that things aren't always very well organized either. And so things inside of a Chinese company can actually get a little bit messy because people are used to being able to resolve problems very, very quickly. And so, looking at tech, it's actually... in the U.S., enterprise software, enterprise solutions have become quite popular. Things like Slack is really popular. Trello, a whole company based out of Australia, Atlassian, has built their entire company on enterprise productivity solutions. Whereas in China, these types of products are not very popular. People are relying on WeChat for the most part to actually get things done, and they don't use email. It's funny, I was talking to someone a while back who was trying to market to Chinese people, and they said that, I tried emailing someone and they never replied to me, and I was like, dude, you can't You can't email a Chinese person. You have to use WeChat. Business cards. You don't need business cards anymore. If someone tries to give me a business card, I say, why? Let's just exchange WeChat. That cuts through it. I mean, I'm just going to use your phone number to find you on WeChat anyway. So I think that that kind of immediacy, because WeChat it's a messaging platform, and messaging platforms, they're designed to be asynchronous, but the way it usually plays out is people expect it to be synchronous. People expect a response very, very quickly.
Yes, yeah, they do. I think Ding though has traction, doesn't it, in the sort of enterprise messaging space?
It does. It's getting a bit more traction. It's backed by Alibaba, so I imagine that they use it in their company as well. But I have not spoken to a Chinese entrepreneur who uses enterprise productivity software that's made in China for Chinese people.
Right. I've got to do a bit of more research on that one, but I'm sure Ding is the market leader in sort of enterprise messaging in China, and it is gaining some traction. WeChat has there also basically WeWork, WeChat for Work enterprise version as well, which people do use. I want to make a point about that really struck me, is that for Chinese tech area, it's not. This might sound really stupid, but it's perhaps I'm just expressing myself poorly. But it's not about the tech. It's about the business model. The Chinese, the companies that we often talk about here, a good example would be something like Meituan Dianping, right? So as of recording this today, Meituan Dianping got a massive investment, right? And this is an O2O, essentially, started off as a mixture of different services, something like Groupon, group discounts, other things like food delivery, and this yes, it's a tech company, I guess. For sure, it's a tech company. They're using technology, but it's about what's really driving them. What is the business model? Is that the internet is enabling them to centralize this whole industry into one and distribute this, organize this whole industry from one centralized platform. And because of the scale of the market, because the internet allows things to scale in ways that they simply couldn't do before the internet.
Yeah.
That's what's really pushing all these huge numbers and this huge interest in this area. So Chinese companies in the tech area are much more focused on the business model and the business opportunity, rather than just doing tech for pure tech's sake, rather than just exploring things. Whereas in Silicon Valley, I think a lot of people have idealistic views about technology, and there's a lot of people who are motivated by making the world a better place and exploring what's possible with technology. The Chinese are more into just making a huge company and earning tons of money.
Yeah. Well, I think
right?
that's a really good point. I think the U.S., I mean, you look at it and it's very clear that the U.S. is much stronger when it comes to research in general. And a lot of that has to do with our very robust university system, where there's a lot of research institutions. And these days there's a lot more funding going into research, both from universities, but then also private organizations as well. Whereas in China is actually kind of lagging behind. The government likes to tout how many patent applications that China has, or the increase in total patent applications that China has made. But a lot of times it's a lot of fluff, and it doesn't necessarily, the patents don't necessarily end up being applied or used in a business or in any other context. And so I think that's actually, I mean, it's a really good point you're making about the almost the lack of technology in Chinese in the Chinese technology ecosystem, where Alibaba, they just pledged to invest, I think it was 15 billion USD over 3 years in R&D. And Jack Ma, when they made the announcement, he said, we haven't really paid enough attention to research and development. And I think that statement was actually very interesting, because if you think about it, Alibaba, or let's take a look at Taobao, for example. I mean, Taobao, it's not really a tech company. It's or a tech product. It is a marketplace. It's a marketplace powered by the internet, and of course they do have recommendation technology. But a lot of that recommendation technology is fairly new. I mean, Taobao's main innovation, at least in the beginning, was escrow. And so, you don't actually pay for an item until you receive it. You check that it actually is what you want. You confirm that you've got it, that you confirm that it is what you want, and then the funds are released. Another great example, I think, is Ofo. I mean, Ofo, which is very successful in bike sharing. They've expanded rapidly in China, and they're doing the same in the United States. When they started, they were not a tech company either. In fact, I mean, they were almost had no tech whatsoever. They had a mobile app that was able to basically you scanned a QR code and it gave you the combination for a manual lock. Around this time last year, we interviewed them at our TechCrunch event here in Beijing. And they said that they had no plans to implement any type of smart lock system, this similar to what Mobike has. Fast forward to now, and they do have a smart lock system, and it has satellite navigation, positioning, software and hardware that comes with that smart lock now. In part because not having that is unsustainable. I mean, how do you locate bikes that need to be fixed? How do you even know where your assets are? But also in part because the many municipal governments are mandating this type of technology. And so, and you look at the opposite end, where Baidu is at its heart a technology company, but in some ways, we interviewed Kaiser Kuo a while back, and I think that one of Baidu's main problems is that they kind of forgot that they were a tech company, because they're in this environment where technology itself is not as important as making money is as quickly as possible. And so I think that really, and also you looking at artificial intelligence, that's kind of the big story for Chinese technology going forward. Is and the big question is how and if China can actually rival the United States in terms of artificial intelligence. Actually, we're about to publish a piece about it, probably as of this recording in a few days. But it looks like, in terms of investments, the United States is far ahead of China in terms of artificial intelligence. And a lot of that is because a deficiency in technological research in general.
Yep. Chinese companies will jump on something if there's an established business model. If there's a way to monetize, then you're going to see rapid adoption in China. If there's no clear way to monetize the technology, nobody cares. Now, that's an exaggeration, of course, but it's kind of like that. A lot of these tech companies, especially the two-sided marketplace ones, or even the ones that are a little bit less two-sided, but Ofo is actually a great example here. It's about being super fast. It's about scaling to a massive, massive size as quickly as possible. It's about bribing customers, paying to acquire traffic or acquire users, and get into a stage where you control the market for 1.3 billion people. And you're in a position where you're in a monopoly or duopoly market eventually, and over the long term, there's massive profits to be made. That's what this game is all about. It's not about, we're going to build companies that push forward humanity. How the mobile phone is different here. So for the average Chinese consumer, because China's such a mobile-centric, mobile-first, mobile-only market, and the phone is it's the remote control for your life. It's the gateway. It's whoever controls the phone ends up controlling large parts of the consumer-facing economy. And how does that phone look different here in China to other parts of the world?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things as well. I mean, you look at, I mean, Apple is doing really well in the rest of the world. They are producing a product that is massively successful to the degree that they are perhaps the most successful company in the entire world. But their biggest problem is China. And I think there's a few different things going on. In part, it is because this market is unique, and there are some unique needs that users have that you don't really find anywhere else. Part of it is the price. The iPhone and other Apple devices are designed for people who are not price sensitive, whereas in China they are very price sensitive. When Xiaomi first came out with their first phone, I mean, it was 1/8 of the cost of the phone of an iPhone at that time. So you look at just from a price perspective, and it should not be surprising that Android, which is at this point really the only alternative. Of course, there is Windows Phone, but no one really uses that. Of course, there is BlackBerry, but BlackBerry's basically dead. So you look at the Chinese market, price sensitive, the need for unique features, and it's not surprising that Android has such a huge part of the smartphone market.
Yeah, the numbers are around 80%, right, for Android, roughly. Maybe it's a bit more, maybe it's 85. I can't remember off the top of my head. And so, yeah, that is a key difference. In China, it's a market dominated by Android phones. In terms of handset makers, it's dominated by local players as well. Huawei, Vivo, Xiaomi, and Oppo would be like the four biggest. And they're all pretty strong in terms of sales. All of those Android phones come with pre-installed apps as well on Android. So that's, I think we see that in other markets around the world, but it's a particularly big thing here in China. Over the years, I've owned a Xiaomi, I have a Huawei now. I never had an Oppo, but most of I've had Samsung as well. I've used a lot of different Android devices, and the ones that all of them bought here in China, and it's quite annoying. They will often pre-install apps on those Android devices that you cannot uninstall. Almost every phone that I've bought, in fact, no, every phone that I've bought in China has had Weibo pre-installed on it. And on many of them, it was set so you could not delete Weibo. I think that for them, they spend a lot of money on that, on pre-installing their app with the carriers and with the telecoms. A lot of phones in China are linked to the network, so you can only use them for China Mobile or China Unicom. Again, we see that in other markets around the world. That's not too different. But the pre-installed app, also a huge difference is because there's no Google Play, right, in the China market. So that's a biggie. So there's no Google Play is blocked here in China, which means if you buy a Huawei phone, it's going to have a Huawei App Store pre-installed on there, and for you to actively, of course, you can install other app stores, and I always do, but especially for unsavvy tech, older generation, or perhaps maybe even very young people as well, they're not going to know how potentially, or they're not going to bother. They'll make it a little bit difficult to through the default settings to actually install a second app store on that phone, and that means that the in this case for Huawei, they're actually controlling the app store. That's a pretty big difference between what we see in the rest of the world, where Google Play has got a very dominant position, and here in China, where the Android App Store market is quite fragmented. and has changed a lot over time. I think the market leader right now is Yingyongbao, which is Tencent's product, and they've been able to gain traction on that through several ways, but one of the big ways is actually WeChat and QQ encouraging users to download through those channels. But they've got nowhere near the dominance of Google Play, and so what we'll talk about later on is actually the big internet companies are sort of becoming increasingly dominant in China, and the big apps are becoming increasingly dominant, and that's being fueled by this war that's happening with the app stores, which the big players are starting to win that war.
Yeah, and it's that connection to like the ecosystems that these larger companies are building. We mentioned before how the internet economy and the technology ecosystem moves very, very fast, and the economy in China moves very, very fast. But you look at the growth of Alibaba, of Tencent, and Baidu to a certain degree, and because they were so early to the internet, they actually were founded at a time where internet growth or internet fueled growth was much slower, and a lot of the fast expansion that we're seeing is almost in a sense under the aegis of these much larger companies carving out their own ecosystems, and so. You look at Tencent and its Android App Store. I mean, why would Tencent have its own Android App Store? Well, because it can monetize through that, either by directly interfacing into in-app purchases for the applications on there. Why would Alibaba go into food delivery? Because it's an extension of their payment system, and so all of these different threads coming from the core business of these different internet giants is really kind of what has been fueling this all these major expansions, and you look at almost any vertical these days, it's going to be a proxy war at this point between Tencent and Alibaba. You look at Mobike and Ofo. Alibaba is a major backer of Ofo. Tencent is a major backer of Mobike. In the past, when there were two different companies, I believe Alibaba was a major backer of. I can always get them confused. But anyway, so when Didi and Kuaidi were separate companies, each company backed their own player. When you look at e-commerce, it's very, very clear. You have Alibaba, Taobao, Tmall, and Jingdong, and a major backer, of course, of Jingdong is Tencent. And so it's super interesting to see how these companies are creating their ecosystems, and in order to make sure that they're not disrupted in some area, in order to make sure that their core business isn't somehow threatened, in some ways they're almost fueling a lot of this rapid growth. And startups and entrepreneurs, I mean, they're looking at, okay, what are these companies interested in? VCs, they're thinking, okay, what are these companies interested in? Because their main way of exiting, as it is around the world, is either going to be through an IPO, or it's going to be through an acquisition. And so, looking at the ecosystem in that way, it's just a lot of it is just these companies trying to do their best to build these defensive moats around their businesses.
Yeah, I think the app stores is particularly important because it's a choke point, right? It's a choke point in the system. If you control the app store, then you can have a massive influence on what people download. I was just playing around while you were talking there, John, with the Tencent App Store. I searched for Taobao, and it's got Taobao in there. So Taobao's the sort of flagship product for Alibaba, their competitor, right? And you can download Taobao on the Tencent App Store. They're not going to block it. Why? Because it's too big, right? If you block that one, people will stop not using your app store. So they can't block it, but if you search for it, then JD pops up next to it with a little icon saying recommended. It's so little things like that. They will use any way they can to try and push you to use a partner within their ecosystem rather than the competitor one. So we're seeing that the open web is I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the open web is dying or it's dead in China. It's all because the phone is the center of the internet here, and the phone is a sort of app economy. It's not about web pages so much, and we're seeing a situation now where it's really these two guys, Tencent and Alibaba. They are getting stronger and stronger, and they're controlling the app stores. They're controlling even when we look at things like the SIM card that you use. So very recently, there's been developments in terms of there's now something called a how do you say it in English? Dawang card in Chinese, right? It's like a king card, I guess. Like it's a cooperation between Tencent and China Unicom, where you can buy this special SIM card, and then all of the data that you use on Tencent apps or Tencent-friendly apps is free. It's a fantastic plan. My wife got one of them recently. It's amazing. It's like, this is great. I can use all these apps on my data plan all day long outside, and I don't need to pay anything. And of course, Alibaba's doing their version as well. So that, in terms of, that's completely against net neutrality. Right? It's just throwing net neutrality out of the window. Not that anybody cares in China. There's very little debate about this kind of stuff. So if you're on one of those plans, now you've got a massive reason to use only Alibaba-friendly apps if you're using Alibaba's version of that SIM card. And then if you're using their app store, well, they're going to tilt the field so that when you search for anything, their apps are going to pop up first. All these sort of different ways that they're going to try and skew things together so that you're in their ecosystem. And these are really walled gardens. They don't talk to each other. If you find something on Taobao, which is an Alibaba app, and you want to send that to someone on WeChat, which is in the Tencent ecosystem, you can't send a link directly. You have to copy a special code, which is just text, and send it to them, and then they have to copy that code and send it back over to Taobao. And it's similar the other way. So these gardens, these walled gardens, don't talk to each other. They're separated, and it's a massive difference from what we see in the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I think that this idea of net neutrality and how it doesn't exist in China is really fascinating to see. So I have experience working with Huawei, helping them with their technical documentation, and this is all public. I mean, you can look at their manuals, and it'll say it right there. But there is this concept in networking called quality of service. And so quality of service is a way for a network administrator, and by network administrator, this could be someone on a corporate network, managing less than 1,000 users. It could be a network admin. We're talking about massive ISPs and things like that. So quality of service is a way for network administrators to determine what types of traffic gets priority. So whether it's video, whether it's audio, whether it's just pure HTML or something like that. But the thing is, I mean, like QoS, it's built. It's in one of its features is that you can actually give priority to users as well. So not just types of content, but also users. And so I think that it's absolutely fascinating because this technology is already there. In a lot of ways, technology in and of itself is value neutral. And so you look at how the debates are developing or have developed in the United States, and whereas in China there is no debate about net neutrality. It's very, very clear that, that Tencent would want to encourage people to use Tencent products. And so they're going to do what they think is best in order to do that. Alibaba is going to do the exact same thing. And I don't think I've never heard anyone say, I've never heard a Chinese person question this. And it's just, well, yeah, of course, that's what they're going to do. That's how you make sure that people still use your products. And it's great for me. I mean, I can, access these things for free. And so, yeah, so it is super, super fascinating to see that net neutrality does not exist in China, and it all comes down to values. We talked in a recent podcast episode when we're looking at the relationship between the government and the open internet, and how it's very, very different. The attitudes are very, very different in the West and in China, and the same thing is true for net neutrality. I mean, we're living in a place where centralized control is normal, where openness and individual freedom are not necessarily priorities. So why is it? I mean, why would it not be okay for companies to create ways to decrease friction to their own products that might be against Western principles, but those Western principles don't exist in China.
Yes, exactly. There's less awareness in the market from consumers, and also these two companies, which are becoming increasingly similar. So they started off from very, very different places. Alibaba started off from pure e-commerce. Tencent started off from social and gaming. And now they're investing in almost every single market that has some involvement in the sort of app economy or tech area, because these guys now are controlling the phone, right? So if you control the phone in China, the phone is the source of all data for customer-facing businesses. It's the customer touch point for anyone that wants people to buy something or use their service, if it's something that involves a digitalization of some aspect of that business. So in effect, they are controlling a huge part of the B2C economy in China. That's why you're seeing their share prices skyrocket, is because the world is waking up to the fact, and also the Chinese government is waking up to the fact that these guys have got incredibly powerful. And due to the winner-takes-all economics of the internet, nobody is in a position really to challenge them much. And I think that's why you're seeing the government wanting to take small equity stakes in these guys, clipping their wings by fining them for actually quite ridiculous things. They want to let these guys know that they're still in control, whereas actually it's got to a stage which is, we do need to question whether this is healthy for the economy in the long run. But we're in a situation now where China is, in terms of payments, because payments are all being digitalized, payments are controlled by Alipay and WeChat for digital payments on mobile. In terms of data, because now there's these two big ecosystems that they're all invested in, they control all the data in the economy. And in terms of, as I said before, the user habits and the customer relationship, when they open up their phone to do something, they're using a product, a platform which is invested or directly controlled by one of those two companies, where they're really in charge of the whole value chain. And that's quite scary, actually. And I think the government is probably looking at this and thinking how they can manage this situation as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the government is always very watchful of how the market is developing, and you look at the ubiquity of mobile payments, which is really kind of what is really in a lot of ways pushing a lot of this development. I mean, you look at, again, Didi and Kuaidi. That in many ways was a way for people to start actually using mobile payments, and it's only just recently that the central government is actually forcing them to go through a clearinghouse to actually clear and settle through a government controlled body.
How does this environment affect the startup ecosystem in China? It has a massive effect. Imagine you're a startup and you're in a new area, you're trying something out, and you're starting to gain traction, building a new product in a new area, and then one of these guys turns up and wants to invest in you. That's almost the same as a mafia godfather turning up and making you an offer you can't refuse, because you're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. If you don't take their investment, then they're going to invest in one of your competitors, and then when they do that, it's not just that they're just going to be bringing massive financial firepower to one of your competitors. The bigger impact is going to be that they're able to drive massive traffic to your competitor, potentially through an app store, through a social network, or for other means. So if as a startup, if Tencent wants to invest in you in China, you have to make a very, very difficult decision. And it's very difficult for you to, as a small player, to grow big without taking an investment from one of those two guys now. That's why if you go back and listen to our episode about Toutiao, we were talking about that and saying how Toutiao is so different and so interesting because they've managed to grow without taking an investment from one of those two guys. And that's really quite special and quite unique. If we look at most other areas, the norm would be that there is a clear, there's a market where Tencent has chosen a company to invest in, and Ali has chosen a company to invest in, and with the backing of those two guys, eventually those two companies will gain market dominance. It's not that simple. There's different variations of it. Some of them which we covered before. Food delivery is a good example. So in the food delivery space, Baidu is also involved, but very recently they sort of gave up and sold out to Ali, and now it's very clear a duopoly between Tencent and Alibaba. So from a startup ecosystem point of view, if what you're doing is suddenly if you're in a space and then you get an investment from one of those guys, that will spark a war. That will spark massive investment and massive interest. And we saw this happen in bike share, right? As soon as Alibaba and Tencent got involved, the whole thing blew up like crazy, because now it's not just now it's an area where these guys are supercharging the competition and supercharging and accelerating the expansion of this new area. And that doesn't really happen in the rest of the world in that same way.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Also, I think that looking at the activity from the giants in China, it's also almost a way to legitimize the market. And so I think that's also what kind of happens is that smaller investors, they see that Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, JD, or whomever, they're getting into a certain area. And they said, okay, now is the time to start jumping in, because they've given their blessing that this is a legitimate market, and now it's time to really start investing a little bit more in it. But also, it's actually you look at what types of companies Tencent and Alibaba are investing in. And it's also a way for them to legitimize the companies themselves, because what happens is when these markets are developing, there's a lot of there are some bad actors. There are some companies who are either fraudulently raising funds, or perhaps they don't really have much of a business model. But you look at what Tencent and Alibaba, what they're investing in, and they take their investments very, very seriously, as you might imagine. If they're going to invest in a company, it's because they know that they can get them to integrate into their ecosystem. They know that they have a product that can actually win in the Chinese market. And so, once Tencent or Alibaba decide to back a company, that's a big deal, because they're given their seal of approval, and they're immediately plugged in to that ecosystem, which at this point is, that covers almost every aspect of the Chinese internet, or at least the consumer internet. So if you can gain the attention of a Tencent or an Alibaba as a startup here in China, and you can get them to give you money, they're not just giving you money. They're also saying, hey, we're gonna support your growth, and if it's a strategic area, expect to grow very, very quickly. So that was our first reference episode. I think there's still quite a bit of stuff that we did not get a chance to cover. I mean, we're going a little long already, and we don't want to take up too much of your time. But if you enjoyed this episode, as always, we really appreciate it if you left a review. You can find a link to how to do that in iTunes in the show notes, and we really appreciate it if you do it. It's a great way to show your support.